I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to talk about the foundation of our democracy, the right to vote, and why we must protect it. I want to begin just by telling a little bit about me. My story is somewhat unique. I didn't take the traditional path to Congress. Before I got here, I played in the NFL for 5 years as a linebacker for the Tennessee Titans. And after hurting my neck, decided to pursue my other dream, which was become a voting rights attorney, a civil rights attorney. And while I was in law school, I decided to focus on voting rights because of what I saw happening in my home state of Texas, where it was becoming harder to vote as the state was becoming more and more diverse. So I came back to Texas and worked doing voter protection in 2014, setting up poll watcher programs across the state of Texas, trying to help voters deal with the new voter ID law that had just been put in place, and that I knew was going to deeply impact so many Texans. Then I became a voting rights litigator, suing states like Ohio and Wisconsin for the laws that they passed, making it harder for the people in their states to vote. And then I was lucky enough to rejoin the Obama administration and finish out that administration. And I decided to come home and run for Congress in my hometown, in my home district where I was born and raised. And in 2018, I ran against an opponent who had been unopposed in 2016, won, and am now proud to be representing the 32nd District of Texas in Congress. In that campaign in 2018, I had the distinct honor of having Congressman John Lewis come join me in Dallas. Mr. Lewis was my hero, and now to have him with me, talking to voters and campaigning with me, was, to say the least, surreal. We went on to become colleagues, and I considered him to be a friend and a mentor. And I know that without John Lewis, I would not be here today. There would be no Congressional Black Caucus. So many of us would not be here today were it not for him, the other civil rights leaders and the foot soldiers who fought for the right to vote. That's why we named this critical piece of legislation after him, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Now, this piece of legislation is not coming out of thin air. It's not a federal takeover. Many of the reforms are intended to address long-held problems with access to the ballot box for many Americans. It's also meant to address the gutting of the Voting Rights Act the Supreme Court did in 2013, and the 440 voting restrictions bills across 49 states that have been introduced in recent years. Now, many of those bills to restrict the right to vote have become law in states like my own, in Texas, in Georgia, and so many other states. And while other pieces address the direct and more recent threat to our democracy, including the counting of votes and the safety and security of election officials, this legislation is necessary for us to save our democracy. And yes, we've had setbacks in this fight. Yesterday was another one. Not enough of our Republican colleagues in the Senate were brave enough to stand up to President Trump's lies and to vote for the same Voting Rights Act that the Senate had unanimously reauthorized in 2006, that my constituent, Republican, President George W. Bush, signed in 2006. And we were just shy of having enough Democrats in the Senate with enough courage to change the rules so that we could protect our democracy. But I'm here to say today to all of my constituents and to anyone across the country who's worried about our democracy that we can't lose hope. We've had setbacks before, just as Mr. Lewis did, and we have come back from them. The American people have sent us a clear message. In 2020, 155 million Americans voted in a pandemic. They risked their lives to vote. That's how important it was to them. Campaign finance reform, ending partisan gerrymandering, expanding access to the ballot by creating national standards around voter registration, early voting, and vote by mail. These are all necessary for us, for our democracy, and they're common sense ideas that are contained in the Freedom to Vote Act. They will fortify and protect this sacred right. But let's talk about what's happening in the country, because I hear all the time from folks that voting is not difficult, that there has not been a rash of voter suppression laws passed across the country, that this is a democratic story that is being told. According to the Brennan Center, between January 1st and September 27th, at least 19 states enacted 33 laws to make it harder for Americans to vote. Restrictive laws in 4 states, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, and Texas imposed new or more stringent criminal penalties on election officials or other individuals for helping their fellow citizens vote. These new criminal laws will deter election officials and others who assist voters from engaging in ordinary, lawful, and often essential tasks. People in Georgia can now be charged with a crime for handing out water and snacks to voters waiting in line to vote, lines that were created intentionally by restricting other ways to vote. Montana eliminated Election Day voter registration, making it harder for new voters or folks who have moved to vote in that state. Arizona temporarily restricted the powers of their Secretary of State to represent them in lawsuits. And the reason? Because that position is held currently by a Democrat. Other states have shortened the window to apply or the deadline to deliver a mail-in ballot, or have eliminated ballot drop boxes and reduced polling places, and the list goes on and on and on. 155 million Americans voted in 2020, the highest turnout since the 1900 election. The Trump administration itself called it the most secure in American history. And yet the lies about the election and the attacks on the right to vote have just continued and continued. And that's why I'm standing here today. Because of this new lie, these new laws have been passed, and we are seeing voter suppression taking place in real time in my home state in Texas. And so I want to just talk about my home state for a little bit, because I hear from a lot of Texans who wonder why voting rights experts like myself say that it is one of the most difficult states in the country to vote. And so I want to walk you through just how difficult it is to cast your ballot in my home state. First, the state of Texas makes it incredibly difficult to register to vote. In order for me to register my neighbors in Dallas County, I need to go to the Dallas County Elections Department, take a short course, and become deputized as a volunteer deputy registrar. That's just to register my neighbors. And after that, I'm able to register voters only in Dallas County. And I'm only able to do that for 2 years, because it's going to expire. Then I have to go back and get it reauthorized. And after I register that voter, which I've done hundreds of times, I have 5 days to deliver the completed form that I filled out with them, or I face criminal penalties. 5 days. So if I lose it, if something happens, I will be held criminally liable. If I would like to register voters in both of the counties in my congressional district, Colin County and Dallas County, I would have to also go to Colin County and get deputized separately there. If I meet a voter who lives in the city of Dallas, but doesn't know what county they live in, because 4 counties touch the city of Dallas, I will not be able to register them unless I know that I'm deputized in their county, whether it be Denton County, Kaufman County, Collin County, Dallas County. I have to figure it out. That's just to register my neighbors as a lawyer, as a voting rights lawyer, for me to help my neighbor get registered. In order to personally register for the next election that I would like to participate in, if a voter would like to participate in the next election, they have to register at least 30 days before that election day. So if, like many young people, you decide that a week out from an election, you're fired up, you're ready to go, you want to vote in that election, guess what? You can't, because you didn't get registered in time. Unlike many other states where they have same-day voter registration, in Texas, you have to have decided 30 days out from the election that you were going to get registered, and hopefully get through all of those other hoops. And right now, as we speak, the Secretary of State's office is citing a paper shortage as a reason why they can't print out enough voter registration forms, despite dragging their feet for years in expanding online voter registration to Texans. That's all just to get registered, Mr. Speaker. We're not even talking about casting your ballot yet. So after you have gone through those hoops, after you've gotten registered, you have to then survive the purges of the voter rolls that are going on right now, such as in 2019, when Texas attempted to kick 100,000 Texans incorrectly off the voter rolls, claiming that they were non-citizens. It was such a disaster, the Secretary of State had to resign. Now, if you've survived that, if you've gotten registered and you've not been purged from the voter rolls, to actually cast your ballot, you have to jump through more hoops. because Texas has the strictest voter ID law in the country. In order for me to vote in the state of Texas, I need to possess one of 7 acceptable forms of ID, which does include a Texas handgun license, but does not include a student ID, like my constituents at SMU or UTD or any school in Dallas might be issued. A Texas District Court found in 2014 that 600,000 registered Texans, or 4.5% of those registered at that time, lacked one of these qualifying IDs. Now, thanks to a court ruling, you can sign a declaration stating that you don't possess that required form of ID. But that is not often communicated at the polling place. I know because I've trained poll watchers to try and watch for this. When voters present themselves and they don't have the required ID, they are often turned away. If you have a disability, or if you're out of town, or you just have difficulty coming to a polling place, you can't vote by mail very easily either. To vote by mail in the state of Texas, you have to be 65 years or older. You have to be sick or disabled, or you have to be out of the county where your election is being held on election day and throughout the entire early voting period. And recently, thanks to the state's voter suppression law, SB 1, this has become even more difficult. As reports from counties from across the state have shown, mail-in ballot applications are being rejected at an alarming rate. That's because this new law requires that people provide either a partial Social Security number or a driver's license number on their application for a mail-in ballot, and that number has to match the identification on their voter registration. This makes it extremely difficult for voters to remember which ID they used when they registered, perhaps decades ago. In Dallas and Tarrant counties, right now, 40%, Mr. Speaker, of the applications have been rejected. In Bexar County, where San Antonio is located, it's almost 50%. If this rejection rate holds, tens of thousands of mail-in ballots, and possibly more, will be rejected. It's now a crime, Mr. Speaker, for county officials to encourage folks to vote by mail, meaning that if you are in a household and you're married, and if a spouse requests a mail-in ballot, the county official cannot inform you that your spouse can also request a mail-in ballot if they're eligible, or they face criminal penalties. And that doesn't even scratch the surface of dealing with voters whose names have changed because of marriage or divorce, or a change in gender identity, or whose names no longer match the name on the voter roll. If you possess one of these IDs, and if you're aware of your rights, you may still struggle to find a polling place. According to a report from the Leadership Conference Education Fund, 750 polling places have been closed in Texas since 2012. This has disproportionately happened in counties with large Black and Latino populations. The law also curbed other initiatives by counties to make voting easier that happened during the pandemic, including limiting ballot drop boxes, banning counties from drive-through voting, and opening 24-hour voting locations as they did in Harris County, which is where Houston is. And they even tried to ban Sunday morning early voting to stop souls to the polls until they had too much outrage and they had to back off. Texans in minority communities disproportionately face long lines when they get to the polling place in order to vote. And this includes one Black man in Houston who waited 6 hours to cast his ballot in 2020. And if you make it through all of those hurdles, register to vote, cast your ballot by mail or in person via early voting or on election day, your vote will then be diluted through aggressive partisan gerrymandering at the state House, state Senate, and congressional level. According to the Brennan Center, Texas Democrats would have to win 58% of the vote to be favored to carry more than 37% of the state's congressional seats. That's a state where Joe Biden earned 46.5% of the vote. According to this analysis, Texas would have to vote very heavily for Democrats in order to barely break the gerrymander, and it would still likely leave Republicans with a 2-to-1 seat advantage. This is all due to partisan gerrymandering, which allows politicians to choose their voters instead of the other way around. Gerrymandering doesn't just silence communities, though. It also suppresses the vote. It's well known that competitive elections drive higher turnout, which is why the recent state and congressional maps in Texas sought to limit the number of competitive elections as much as possible. For the Texas voter that has found a way to register, to cast their ballot, and has ignored the impacts of gerrymandering, their vote is still under attack even after they've cast it. Currently, right now, As we are 2 months out from the primary election for our next election, our state's leaders are conducting a so-called audit of the 2020 election results in our largest counties at the request of the former president of the United States, trying to prop up the lie that the last election was stolen from him in a state that he won. All of these hurdles, combined with the potential discriminatory penalties, are making it difficult for the average Texan to feel that they can engage in an election freely. And even worse, states across the country are following Texas's lead. That's why we need to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. The Freedom to Vote Act, just very quickly, for folks who are wondering, because there's a lot of discussion about this, let's talk about what it actually does. It establishes automatic, online, and same-day voter registration, which would solve our voter registration problems in the state of Texas. It makes Election Day a federal holiday, something that should happen. It sets national standards for early voting and vote by mail, requiring 2 weeks of early voting, including 2 weekends, and allowing any American who wants to vote by mail. It bans partisan gerrymandering and establishes clear, neutral standards and rules, as well as increasing transparency and enhanced judicial review. This would address Texas' extremely gerrymandered maps. And it creates a uniform standard for what forms of ID are acceptable for voting. It prevents states from subverting their own elections and protects election records, legislation that I introduced here in the House and that I'm glad to see included in this final bill. And of course, the Voting Rights Act needs to be restored. We need to make sure that we have pre-clearance again. We need to have a national standard. That's what the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act does. This is a bill that passed the Senate 98-0 in 2006. It passed the House overwhelmingly. It was signed into law by my constituent again, President George W. Bush, a Republican. But now not a single Republican in the Senate will vote for it, or in the House. And this brings me to my final thoughts, which is that January 6th, I was just a few rows back from where I'm standing now. The doors to my right were barricaded with furniture like this that we used to hold paper as a mob tried to break in and prevent us from ratifying the results of an American presidential election. I, along with my colleagues, like Mr. Jones, who's here with me, were prepared for the worst. These doors were locked. We didn't know if there would be a way out, but we were determined to do our job. I think the most important thing that happened on January 6th, the thing I hope people remember that happened, isn't that we had to evacuate the House floor. I hope they remember that we came back. We came back while there was still blood on the walls, while there's still broken glass on the floor, while we ourselves were dealing with our own emotional response to what had happened, while we ourselves were shaken. We came back, and we voted, yes, in a bipartisan way, to affirm an American presidential election. Our democracy held, just barely. But since then, we've seen a more clever, slower attempt to accomplish the same thing that those rioters tried to do on January 6th, which is to subvert the will of the American people. We've seen it in state after state. We've seen the worst rash of voter suppression laws that we've had in this country since the days of Jim Crow. And in many ways, it is worse because it's not 1965, Mr. Speaker. It's 2022, and we should have made more progress by now. We should not be having this conversation about whether or not certain Americans should be able to vote in our elections. We've had this problem since the passage of the 15th Amendment. The idea that certain votes matter more than others, or that certain people who live in certain places, that their votes are inherently fraudulent, or that they don't know enough to be involved in an election. But I'll tell you what, I believe in the American people. I believe that they know that our democracy is what makes our country great. Our democracy is what allows us to have this thriving economy. People are trying everything they can to get into this country still. They're not trying to join some of our autocratic opponents, they're not trying to break into Russia and to China. They want to come to the United States. We're still a beacon of hope for the world. When strongmen and autocrats worry about the United States, it's not just our military they worry about, it's our ideas. It's the idea of the United States. And while that idea is under attack, I believe it's going to stand strong. And so I would want to say, Mr. Speaker, to all of my constituents, to anyone who may be listening to this, the fight to protect the right to vote is far from over. The Senate may not have done its job yesterday, but I and my colleagues will not give up that fight. And with that, I want to yield